What's the words? Another installation of truth my mama told me. Listen, I figured out how people like BLOKCOM and KKILO make these claims of black racism. What they're doing is they're associating certain scholarly input with pretty extreme people. For example, someone like Dr. Francis Cress Welsing is associated with someone like SETI, not to discredit either one of them, but I don't think they're actually saying the same thing. For example, when Dr. Welsing has a conversation about genetics and discusses in the formal language of genetics, dominant genetic material versus recessive genetic material, again, she's discussing and using the verbiage of genetics. Those are not her words. Those are the words that describe white mice that result from series of matings between brown mice, and eventually a white mouse pops up, or white rose, where fertilization of red roses after roses of red roses and roses produce a white rose, or a white tiger. That is the result of breedings and breedings and breedings of brown and gold tigers. Eventually a white recessive tiger pops up, a white recessive rose pops up, a white recessive mouse pops up. It's a genetic defect. All right. So when we look at white skin, colorless skin, it is just that genetic defect. That's what that is. It's just a genetic deficiency state. So this really is a conversation of chronology. When we're discussing dominant and recessive, all we're saying is one has come before the other. When the conversation about dominant and recessive is a conversation saying white people came after black people because you couldn't produce white people, because number one, white people can't produce any black people, while black people, through albinism, can produce colorless, like blonde-haired, blue-eyed, green-eyed people. We can produce these people. White people cannot produce any black people. So that conversation is simply to understand the chronology of who has been on the planet first. But here's what here's what KKILO do. They take this conversation about dominant and recessive and turn it into a conversation of superior and inferior. So they say, oh, you're saying you're dominant genetically. That means you're saying you are superior. That means you're a black racist. Absurd. It says nothing of that. What it does say is you cannot get the recessive. The recessive cannot produce the dominant produces the recessive. Again, it's a conversation of chronology. The problem is just the word dominant scares you people. Simply knowing that the word dominant and associating with anyone, you assume that to be racist. Again, that is the formal language of genetics. It has nothing to do with race, and all to do with chronology. Because throughout history, you can look at the neo-Nazis that are on YouTube, or look at a lot of white people who subconsciously will never accept the fact that black people were the first people on the planet. So many white people say that white people evolved outside of Africa about 60,000 years ago. Cool. But people have been on the planet for millions of years. So millions of years before white people ever existed or evolved outside of Africa, people were here. So that's just, again, it's a conversation of chronology. But what the anti-racists do is they turn it into a conversation of superiority, inferiority. That's how they claim that Dr. Welsing is, like, for example, Dr. Francis Cress Welsing is a black racist afrocentrist. The beauty of Dr. Welsing's theory is that it is behavioral based. It is not a theory of conjecture such that she's imagining what certain behaviors would be or imagining what certain people might do. For example, when a lot of times when people discuss black racism, one of the most common statements is, if black people were in power, they would do the same thing. That may or may not be true. However, that is hypothetical. Because the fact of the matter is, the observed empirical data shows what white people are willing to do when they are in power. The behavior of whites is observable, it's tangible, it's in the records, it's contemporary. You don't need to hypothesize it. It's a practice. It's not hypothetical. Let's be clear. She's discussing tanning, the idea that whites brown their skin in an industrial effort, risking skin cancer in the process. She discusses the attack on male genitalia. When lynching was during lynching, a common practice during lynching was to castrate black males. Even black females who were pregnant had babies taken out of them and stomped during lynchings. So it is in the history of whites to castrate blacks during lynching. That's in the history books. BLOKCOM, if you didn't know that, that means you are ignorant. You don't really know history. And I can understand why a lot of people don't want to look back at history. Because some people's history, a lot of people's history, when it comes to other people, has been, to quote Dr. Welsing, confrontation. The third observed behavior that Dr. Welsing discusses is white supremacists, and the vast majority of whites promote themselves as genetically superior while non-white is genetically inferior. Hitler's argument against the Jews wasn't about their beliefs more than it was about the fact that he considered them to be non-white. If Hitler did not think that Jews were non-whites, then Hitler and the Nazis would not have performed so many genetic experiments on Jews. You don't perform genetic experiments on someone because you think they believe in something different in terms of religion. You perform genetic experiments on somebody because you want to show that they are different than you genetically. Remember, Nazis today discuss purity of their race. Nazis today discuss the superiority of the white race. So this is the common behavior of white supremacists and pretty much the vast majority of a lot of white people. They believe that they're genetically superior to blacks. So that's the third behavior. The fourth behavior that Dr. Welsing observed is the literature on how the declining population of whites will be in both the United States and in Europe. The year 2050. The year 2050 is popular in media because that is the year in which the United States will be the majority non-white. For example, when Dr. Welsing was on Joe Donahue's show, he pulled out an article discussing the declining population, declining Western populations. She discussed an article that discussed the declining populations in the United States of whites. In economic development literature, you will find plenty of literature that discusses the relationship between higher incomes and lower birth rates. If you look at countries like Scandinavia, Finland, where they have high amounts of income, Sweden, there's very low birth rates. So this is not the language, this is not the discussion of blacks or discussion of other non-whites. This is a discussion of white people. This is the discussion of white media. This is the discussion of the common mainstream. They are concerned with their numbers. And so here is Dr. Welsing's theory again. Based on these behaviors, she's saying, look, whites are the overwhelming minority. They are concerned with their numerical inadequacy. They're concerned with the color of their skin, their colorlessness. If they weren't concerned with their numbers and the color of their skin, with their genetic material, and the fragility of their genetic material, then they wouldn't be writing books like The Dearth of Birth. They wouldn't be constantly claiming that blacks are inferior genetically. They wouldn't be tanning their skin in an industrial effort. They would not attack the genitalia of black men when non-whites have never attacked the genitalia of whites. So this is the behavior she's discussing. So in order for you to discuss her theory, and if you want to debunk her theory, what you first must do is, what is your explanation for these behaviors? Here's what I've heard so far. Why do white people tan their skin? Why do white people look at their skin as not attractive? Why do the majority of white people never tan their skin? Here's what I've heard. White people tan their skin because they like to tan their skin. No, that's not a reason. You don't define, you don't offer a reason for some action by the reason itself. It's circular logic. It does not work. It does not compute. So if you want to really discuss Dr. Welsing, if you really want to have an honest conversation about what she's saying, don't associate her with people like SETI. I don't even think SETI would, but if you were to ask him, I don't think he would think that he is on the level of Dr. Welsing in terms of credibility. Now, I respect SETI. Now, I could probably do without some of his rhetoric, but I can ignore his rhetoric and pay attention to the facts. And if there's anything that I disagree with on his facts, if anything I've heard him say, I check on it and I research on it. If I disagree with it, I disagree with it. But his rhetoric, I can ignore. But you can't ignore some of the facts that he discusses. And nor can you ignore the mission that KKILO is on, the mission that a lot of whites are on, the mission that Black Genetalia is on, to simply discredit blacks, discredit them, and to rewrite history as it's always been rewritten. When you discuss the Olmecs, it was ridiculous. I mean, the notion that black people who were here for millions of years, prior to, even as most white people admit, prior to the advent of white people, if we weren't here millions of years, you mean to tell me we couldn't have went across the planet before white people and had some influence elsewhere? So millions of years, black people have been sitting in Africa, never ventured outside of Africa, not once. So millions of years pass along, white people come along. In 1400s, they start circumnavigating the globe, and they're the first people to be around, walk around, to float around the planet. Well, we've been here for millions of years before you. Come on. That's the point. So if you really want to deal with Dr. Welsing, know her theory. If you wish to debunk her theory, then you must explain those behaviors. You cannot say, oh, that doesn't mean anything. You must explain her behavior. If she's wrong, explain her behavior. She will openly admit it's just her theory. But to me, it is the most cogent and the most logical explanation for why everywhere that whites have been on the planet, they have been confrontational with others, particularly people, with everyone else of color, because they are the overwhelming minority on the planet. Think about her theory. Stop associating a scholar like Dr. Welsing with someone like SETI. Respect the SETI. The brother knows what he's talking about. Like I said, I can ignore his rhetoric. I can hear the Peckerwood and all that stuff. I can ignore that stuff in reality. But what you really need to do is focus on what he's saying. If there's something that you disagree with, his opinions, the facts. Like I saw SETI in a debate with a couple of Moors. He roasted him. He killed him. He brought out the fact. He used just documentation. It's not like, look, he took himself out of the argument. He said, look, this book, this information is all in the book, all in the Marcus Garvey's organization. You want to argue with me, you must argue with the facts in this book. Here's Noble Drew Ali's type boy. Here he is all up in Garvey's organization. He just broke it down historically and made the connection. So if you disagree with the data, then let's discuss the data. If you disagree with the facts, let's discuss them. Show where they're wrong. Too often, all you do is conclude, that means this, that means that, without showing it. If you're going to show and prove something, you must start with some definitions. Start with some axioms that we believe are true. Then show how these things are true, or if they're false. Prove them. But don't just say that they're wrong. Don't just say that she's an afrocentrist racist. Don't just call black people racist. Because we even have to come with a good definition of what racism is. But that's next time. So the bottom line is, if you really want to discuss Dr. Welsing, discuss those behaviors. If you disagree with those behaviors, what's your explanation for those behaviors? I want to hear them.